Welcome back, guys. Today's episode, I am sharing 8 true Airbnb horror stories. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I booked the Lisbon studio because the listing made me feel like I could control time. That's how they get me. Clean lines, white walls, a few well-placed plants, and a labeled floor plan that looks like a promise. The apartment was in a building older than any decision I've made, tucked up a hill where the calçada stones sweat in the afternoon and trams grind past like someone dragging a fork across a plate. It smelled faintly of bleach and baking sugar from the cafe downstairs. When I set my bag on the bed, the sheets felt crisp cold against the heat of the day, like the room had been emptied of someone else moments before I arrived. The host, Marta, had messaged twice. Once to send a digital guidebook with cheerful bullet points, and once to remind me that it was an old building with character. I'm not from here. I don't know the difference between character and warning yet. But I liked the way the studio held itself together, the wood beams painted white, the brass key that felt too heavy for the keyhole, the little window with a sliver view of laundry lines and chipped blue tiles. Calm. Ordered. If you've ever had your life peel off in strips, you know how seductive a floor plan can be. Everything holding still where you expect it to be. I unpacked enough to pretend I lived there. Toiletries arranged, charger plugged in. I think that's when I noticed the draft. It was that thin, confident kind of air that doesn't ask permission. It finds the narrowest seam and insists on being felt. My ankles chilled before I could place the source, and then my eyes snagged on the built-in wardrobe against the far wall. The baseboard beneath it didn't match the rest of the room, mitered differently, one corner slightly proud. The paint line there was a little lazy, too, like someone had rolled quickly and hoped nobody would stand at the right angle in the right light to see. I took the laminated floor plan from the counter and held it up, half joking with myself. On paper, the wall ran uninterrupted, just wardrobe and a 3-drawer unit. But in person, if you leaned close, there was a seam in the plaster beside the wardrobe frame, paint slightly thicker along the edge the way paint gets when it's sealing a gap, not covering a wall. My finger found the seam like a tongue finds the one tooth that hurts. It felt warmer than the rest of the wall, slightly tacky. When I pressed, the tiniest give. I told myself it was an expansion joint or some old service patch. Buildings like these, they breathe. The whole place had a gentle sway when trucks went by, barely there, like a person shifting in their sleep. I turned on the fan, which made a low, polite sound, and sat by the window pretending the white noise was enough. Down in the street, someone laughed so hard they coughed, and a dog barked in 3 annoyed syllables. Normal life pushing in on all sides, that's what I wanted. Normal life. I don't know why I pressed again. I think it was the draft. It wasn't constant, it pulsed. Not with the fan, not with the traffic. It felt timed to something more intimate, like the building's own exhale. My fingertips slid along the seam until it met a place where the paint had swelled over a hidden screw head. The baseboard under the wardrobe had a scuff too high to be from shoes. If you looked dead on, the wardrobe's shadow wasn't consistent. A narrow strip at its base was just a bit darker, as if the light was falling into something it shouldn't. I remember laughing, quiet and breathless, because it hit me in a wave that I was going to be the kind of person who finds a door that isn't on a floor plan. There was a latch, but not how a latch wants to be found. My fingernail traced the paint ridge until it bumped a recessed oval, flush-pull hardware that had been sealed over. Years of repainting had turned it into a blister. The first tug hurt my fingers. The paint stuck and then let go with a soft, sticky tear. The sensation made my teeth ache. Underneath, the metal was cool and scored with fine scratches like someone had worried it with a ring or a key, or maybe I'm projecting. When the panel moved, it didn't swing. It slid, an old pocket of space reluctantly waking up. The smell that came out wasn't rot. It was colder than that, cleaner, mineral, with a wet plaster sweetness that made me think of basements and hospitals at the same time. I turned the fan off without meaning to, and the silence set. A glass in the sink amplified the room's quiet. I could hear my own breath make a small fabric sound in my chest. I took my phone, opened the flashlight, then hesitated. It felt like a rule had been broken already. Part of me wanted to close the panel and leave it, let the seam be a seam, but the draft had a direction, and it traced my leg with intent now, the way a cat will brush you to get you to notice it at a particular angle. The gap wasn't wide, 20 inches, maybe less, enough that you had to turn sideways to slip in. The interior surface was rawer than the apartment, plaster that had never been sanded smooth, painted once a long time ago in a gray that might have been white when someone cared about it. My shoulder slid along cold grit as I shuffled in, feet careful on what turned out to be a knee-high step down. The beam of my phone widened and revealed a narrow corridor running behind the wall. hugging the geometry of the studio the way tight clothing hugs skin. I could see the shadowed outline of where the bed sat on the other side, an impossibly close echo of T.G.T.'s room I had just left. Dust lay in soft, even drifts, except where it didn't. There were places where it was rubbed into arcs at the height of a hip, a shoulder, the width of an arm turned sideways. A smear at knee level ended in 4 abrupt scalloped crescents, the kind of marks you make when you steady yourself and then stop suddenly. I told myself it was from construction, from when someone installed the wardrobe and then slid their way out. My beam found a nail with thread caught on it, bright as a hair, and farther along a small ring of darker dust, like where a cup had rested for a long time and then not. No words scratched into the plaster, no dramatic signs. Just the long, narrow fact of the space leading along the perimeter. I inched forward because backing out felt like admitting something too soon. On my left, through a flaw in the plaster the size of a lentil, a sliver of the studio appeared. My suitcase, the chair by the window, a slice of sky with laundry moving like breath. The hole wasn't drilled round. It was irregular, Oreo crumb ragged, as if made from the other side with a nail heated and pushed, a shape trying to be precise and failing. When I walked a little more, the lentil hole became another, and another. Not a line so much as a scatter of vantage points, some low, some higher, none exactly at eye level, but all somehow aiming toward where a person might be, and then stop being still. There was a sound, and it was nothing. Old timbers settling, a scooter down the hill, a gull complaining. But the sound braided with the space in a way that made the hair on my forearms feel too alert. A wire ran along the corridor at ankle height, disappearing into a hole and reappearing 3 meters on, old insulation crumbling under the light. On a joist above my head, someone had written a date in pencil, 2019, and a single word in Portuguese I didn't know too. And only later, respiro, breath. The corridor turned at the kitchen. Here it widened by an inch and the draft strengthened, a steady, patient inhale coming from farther along, where a darker shape broke the aimless white. Another panel, this one on the far side, where the studio's entry wall should be. My beam stuttered on what looked like a recessed handle twin to the one I'd pried open, only cleaner. I touched it and felt my own skin temperature reflected back, like someone had warmed it with their hand not too long ago. That's when my heart did something annoying and obvious. It tried to run without me. I stood very still and made a bargain with nothing. I counted to 10. I told myself I would take one more step. I told myself I would listen. From the panel, through whatever thickness of wall and air in my way, I heard the mutest suggestion of outside. Hallway echo, an elevator chime in some other life. A voice paused mid-word. The handle didn't move under my palm, but the draft became so definite that it felt like a hand on my shin. I can pretend I'm brave, but the truth is I backed away sideways, scraping my elbow, the light jittering over the word respiro until I was back where I'd entered, too aware of how long it took the phone's beam to find the original opening. The panel to my studio had slid further than I'd left it, as if nudged, or maybe I had nudged it with my own stupid shoulder in the first place. I'm not sure which reality I believe. The apartment blinked too bright when I stepped out, like someone had turned up the saturation. I slid the panel closed with my foot, wanting to keep my hands clean of it, and the sound it made was soft and intimate, fabric on skin, plaster on plaster, then a subtle suction as the paint stickiness sealed back on itself. I stood there and waited to feel normal. When that didn't happen, I filled a glass at the sink and held it like a prop. I could hear the fry. Anne in the corner pretending it's summer, and beneath it, a private seam of silence heavy as breath withheld. I told myself everything a person like me is supposed to tell themselves. Old buildings have voids, service chases, utility runs, weird walls. It's probably in the listing somewhere, hidden in those phrases that absolve, idiosyncratic layout, period features. The little holes, settling, nails backing out, the draft, physics, warm air rising, cool air finding it. The ring in the dust where a cup had been isn't proof of anything except someone exists who drinks coffee while they work, who once had a reason to rest in a narrow place and did. The warm handle? Mine. Of course it was mine. You can hear me negotiating, right? I messaged Marta anyway because performative normalcy is my specialty. Hey, quick question. There's a sliding panel by the wardrobe. Is that an access space? Just making sure I'm not going to damage anything. I added a smiley face so she'd know I wasn't a problem. I chose a smiley that didn't show teeth. While I waited, I rearranged the furniture by degrees, which in a studio is mostly a trick of angles. The chair turned so its back faced the wall, my bag zipped and placed closer to the door, the glass left full on the counter like a talisman of staying hydrated and rational. Her reply came fast enough to feel like she'd been watching the screen. So sorry. Yes, it's a maintenance corridor. Old building. Please do not enter for your safety. Sharp nails, etc. Let me know if you need anything. 3 exclamation points, one too many. The words had the glaze of having been copied and pasted before. I typed back a thumbs up, then deleted it, then sent it anyway. The message marked read instantly, which was nothing, which was my own phone telling on both of us. Night makes apartments smaller no matter how you arrange them. The city sound thinned, leaving cooler pockets of quiet where voices used to be. I could hear the dog again, farther off, and a high, steady whine from somewhere in the building that I hadn't clocked in the day. I left the fan on and a podcast playing, the kind with 2 people talking about nothing at a speed that makes your brain believe in company. When I turned down the sheets, dust lifted in a small cloud I couldn't see so much as sense, a dry taste behind my tongue that told me I was not alone in the way all rooms aren't alone. They collect skin, breath, the minutiae of everyone who's ever slept in them and failed to be completely erased. I moved the narrow dresser inch by inch until its corner kissed the seam. It didn't block anything, it just made a gesture, like placing a chair under a doorknob in a storybook. In the bathroom, the mirror had mercury spots at the edges, cloud blooms hiding almost nothing. I brushed my teeth longer than necessary, listening to the water hit the porcelain in an even, comforting rhythm. When I turned the tap off, there was the tiniest echo after mine, like a delayed drip, plumb lines and pipes conversing in ways they would whether I was here or not. I climbed into bed and tasted the cooling bleach again, the way it sits under you like a statement of innocence. Sleep didn't come. Sleep sulked. The fan drafted air over my ankles, and the draft from the seam replied in a different register, colder, intermittent. Once, when I was almost under, the wardrobe made a small sound, the sound of wood remembering, and I snapped upright, then laughed, then apologized to nobody. At some point I must have drifted because I woke at 3:11 a.m. with my mouth dry and the feeling that I had just been called by my name from the other room. It wasn't a sound so much as the shape of one, soft, summoning. I lay there and tried to make the shape fit something else, the fan's motor, a distant brake squeal, a neighbor's television syllable. By morning, the studio had reverted to hopeful daylight. The fan was polite again, the air felt neutral, the seam by the wardrobes looked exactly as it had, only not. The dresser, my talismanic barrier, had inched itself away from the wall by, half a finger's width? I told myself I bumped it when I got up, except I hadn't gotten up on that side. A curl of paint lay on the floor like a clipped nail. I crouched and picked it up. The underside was clean and fresh in a way the top was not. When I stood, I noticed something else that is probably nothing. 4 faint ovals on the paint near the recessed pull, a little higher than my hand had been the day before. The smudges parallel and close together, not exactly fingerprints. Too smooth for that. I pressed my own hand there, compared, waited for a match that didn't come. If this were a story that needed closure, this is where I'd give you proof. The hidden camera winking from a pinhole, the host appearing at the door with a lie too elaborate to hold, a neighbor with a key and an explanation. It wasn't like that. It was like this. The word Respiro, written in pencil, in a place you shouldn't be. The steady draft that made me aware of the shape of my own legs. The knowledge that the apartment had a space that obeyed a different logic than the room where I ate and slept. I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself that fear isn't a reason that can move furniture more than an inch. I left the day after with the sheets folded back neatly, the glass washed and upside down, the floor plan put back on the counter under the spoon rest like a map I had obeyed. On the way down the stairs, I paused and listened to the building's breath. The hall smelled of detergent and damp stone. The heavy brass key left my palm feeling empty when I set it in the lockbox. I thought about taking a picture of the seam, but it felt like stealing something from a person I had never met, someone who stands very close to walls and takes their time. I walk, head toward the tram, the hill insisting on its own angle, and for a long time afterward, any draft that touched my ankles made me feel named. We booked the casita because we wanted quiet without consequence. I'd been saying that out loud like it was a mantra, not a retreat, not a test, just a place to be tired in without apologizing for it. The listing said, entire place in 3 separate locations, as if to reassure the part of me that has learned to count. Photos showed white plaster walls, a concrete floor the color of dried riverbed, a low bed framed by rough wood, and outside, Joshua trees throwing their strange, heroic shadows. No nearby neighbors, the host wrote. Desert living, stars. You don't realize how loud a city is until you're an hour and a half east and the noise peels off you. Yucca Valley gave way to something flatter, more exposed. The air had a particular flavor, a metallic sweetness that I learned you call creosote even without rain. The casita sat on a slight rise with a ring of bare earth around it, as if wind had been sweeping in circles for a long time. There was a wind chime made of cutlery on the porch that didn't quite know its own song yet. Inside, the kind of careful minimalism that both calms and scolds. 2 mugs, 2 plates, 2 spoons in a jar. A low shelf with a few desert paperbacks, a jar of matches, and a lidded ceramic pot on the table with salt written on it in thick black marker. Underneath, not for cooking. Evan laughed at that. Who steals salt? And I took the lid off because I'm the kind of person who looks in labeled containers. The crystals were coarse and irregular, not the friendly grains I grew up pinching over eggs. The smell of it was almost clean. There was a welcome binder with a watercolor jackrabbit on the cover. Inside, notes about the swamp cooler. Don't set below 74, it gets humid. A cheerful warning about scorpions. Shake out shoes, don't panic. A sketchy hand-drawn map to Pioneer Town and a place for barbecue that came with 2 exclamation points. TS, and a page with household rules shaded in peach highlighter. The last one read, "Please don't move the rugs, they help with dust. We appreciate your care." There were only 2 rugs. One was a small kilim under the coffee table. The other was a woven runner near the kitchenette. Black and cream diamonds that looked like they were drawn by someone who likes order. 2 of its corners were caught under the legs of the rolling cart that held the hot plate and kettle. The other 2 wanted to curl. When my foot slid across it, the runner felt thicker than it looked, as if there were another layer hiding beneath. I smoothed it flat because the peach highlighter had gotten into my head, and because we were trying to be the kind of people who leave places nicer than we find them, even when we don't feel nice ourselves. The swamp cooler filled the casita with a faint, damp whisper. The desert sun cut hard rectangles on the floor and made the white walls hum. We shook out the sheets like we were making a ritual out of a chore. In the bathroom, the mirror was screwed to the wall with mismatched hardware. The shower ran thin. The concrete under my bare feet kept its own cold, which felt like a gift. The quiet here wasn't empty. It pressed. There's a weight to the way sound behaves without tall buildings to ricochet from. You hear small things from far away. A grasshopper, the distant squeal of a dirt bike, and then unbroken distance again. I found the draft by accident when I sat on the floor to plug my phone charger behind the rolling cart. It was subtle and exact, like breath threading a needle. Cool air rose against my knuckles from the rug's edge. When I peeled the corner back to look, I felt ridiculous, like I was lifting a veil in a church. The concrete beneath wasn't uniform. A hairline seam ran a neat rectangle, just wider than the rug, like a lid poured with intention. The runner's width matched it too perfectly for accident. I let the corner fall and slid the cart back a fraction so the wheel caught the rug's edge again. "Don't start," Evan said, smiling without meaning much by it, and I didn't say I already had. We read the binder sitting cross-legged on the bed because that was the angle that made the room feel most like a nest. The host had left a note in loopy handwriting on the first page. "So happy you're here. Entire place is yours. Please reach out with any questions." She'd drawn a tiny heart that had bled through the paper. Outside, the lights softened. The wind chime found a rhythm that sounded almost like a deliberate code and then didn't. I tried to believe the rug was just a rug and the word entire was not a talisman but a descriptor. The ceramic salt pot looked back at me. Not for cooking. I put the lid on more firmly than it needed and told myself we'd go to Pappy Harriet's like tourists and come back too full to think fast thoughts. It wasn't curiosity that moved the cart. It was the draft's insistence, a repeated neutral hello against my ankle that made me want to understand the shape of the room I was in. We pushed the rolling cart just enough to free the runner's edge, and I peeled it back like the binding on a book. The rug had weight as if something had been sewn into its hem. Underneath, the rectangle in the concrete was cleaner than the rest of the floor, a shade lighter, edges beveled so slight that your fingers noticed it before your eyes did. A recessed iron ring sat flush along one side, painted once and worn to metal where hands had worried it. The peach highlighter in my head lit up brighter. "Maintenance," Evans said, though for what we couldn't name. He crouched with me and we both put our fingertips to the iron. It was warmer than the floor, which I told myself was how metal holds the day's heat. We lifted. The lid resisted the way something resists on purpose, then yielded an inch at a time, the sound a dry kiss of concrete on concrete. The smell that rose was an inland ocean. Mineral and clean, not rot or mold. Cool air gathered in the back of my throat and made me salivate. I thought of basements and salt caverns I'd seen on the internet, places with stalactites and people moving slow. A wooden ladder leaned against one side of the opening, worn into smoothness along the rails. My phone light met a shallow room 4 feet below the floor. It wasn't a crawl space exactly. It was finished enough to pretend it being a room. Plastered walls, a poured floor, corners square, and lines. A delicate geometry drawn with care and a steady hand. Lines of salt, crisp and bright, poured in narrow ridges along the perimeter, and then inside that perimeter in secondary shapes. An oval, a pair of parallel arcs, a crossbar that didn't quite touch. Someone who knew what they were doing had done this, and recently enough that the light could raise a sparkle. In the far corner a hammock hung from eye bolts, white rope against white wall, fabric faded into the color of old bone. It moved almost imperceptibly in the draft our opening had made, the kind of slow sway a room keeps for a long time after a body gets up. I felt heat before I dared touch it. A warmth pooled in the hammock's center as if the fabric remembered. That warmth next to the cool air made something in me misfire. My stomach clenched with the math of opposing signs. On the floor, beside the hammock, a chipped enamel mug sat empty with salt crystals clinging to one side. The dust was undisturbed. The salt lines were not. "What is this?" Evan asked, and the question was too big. He had his hands on his knees like he was ready to drop in and then thought better of it. "It's for pests," he tried again, reaching for something useful. "People use diatomaceous earth, right?" As if saying a hard word makes it true. The host's ceramic salt pot on the table upstairs answered us by existing. "Not for cooking." I wanted to put the lid back on the ground. Instead, I took a picture I didn't want on my phone and texted the host, a careful domestic message. "Hi, quick question. There's a floor hatch under the kitchen runner. Is that a maintenance space we should avoid? Just want to make sure we're following house rules." I added a little desert emoji because I didn't want to sound like a problem. While I waited for the 3 dots, I closed the hatch again gently, guiding the iron ring down so it wouldn't clack, then smoothed the rug into alignment with its old companions. The wheels of the cart, the edge of the concrete island, the words "entire place" in my head like a label I could stick back on. We drove to dinner anyway because the day had its own inertia. Pioneer Town did the thing it does where it looks like a movie set because it is one. At the bar, conversation rose and fell in comfortable little tides. Evan talked about work the way you talk about an ankle that's almost healed. I kept thinking I could taste salt where there wasn't any. The sky outside turned the color of a bruise that isn't yours. When the host finally replied, the message was brisk. "Yes, that's a crawl space for utilities. Please keep closed. Desert pests and dust. Thanks for checking." No exclamation point this time. No heart. The road back to the casita didn't remember us. Coyotes voiced their opinions in a chorus we both pretended not to hear. The wind chimes said hello and then goodbye. Inside, the air was a degree warmer than outside in that way desert houses always are at night, holding on to what the sun has done. The runner lay where we left it. The cart's wheels had not rolled by themselves. I could have gone to bed and sealed the night behind my lids. Instead, I moved the cart again, because I am a person who wants to prove to herself that a thing is still where she left it. The iron ring was colder now, a quick bite into my palm. We lifted. The smell rose again, and with it a sound I had not expected to be so private. The sound of grains sliding infinitesimally over one another. The hush of heavy sugar poured slowly and stopped midstream. The salt lines were different, not ruined, no careless footprints, no smear of a hand, but altered the way a careful person would alter them. Loops repeated around the base of the ladder, not quite closed circles reconnecting to themselves in slightly different places, as if something had paced there, each step just off the last, making an embroidery of almosts. The hammock gave one clean, uninterested sway, and was still. I keep trying to tell this in a way that will make me sound braver. The truth is, we froze. My phone's light chose its own pulse, brightening and dulling when my hand trembled. Evan whispered no, like he could object to the shape of the lines, and then said it again more firmly in a voice that was trying to be useful. "Mice." He crouched and pointed to an oval in the salt that could have been the pad of a foot if a foot were cleaner, less interested in toes. Ringtails, I don't know. He touched the ladder and then wiped his hand on his jeans even though it wasn't dirty. I wanted to be the one to get it right. "People do lines of diatomaceous earth for bugs," I said, borrowing his earlier word, "but this is too elegant for scorpions." The loops around the ladder were not a barrier so much as a rehearsal, each concentric, not quite the same radius, like someone in a room had learned the exact distance their foot could fall in the dark and then tested it again, sanded to a habit. The movements had kept to the design, not ruined it, as if the lines themselves were a map that had been followed. That idea slid into me and sat heavy. I closed the hatch because I wanted to seal the salt back into itself, like putting a lid on a jar so the smell of what was inside stayed inside. The iron ring clicked against the concrete without meaning to, and the sound echoed in a way that made the room above feel suddenly very small. We covered the rectangle with the runner and rolled the cart back until its wheels arrested the corner where it always was. It was a symbolic act, a towel against a door in a flood, but it gave my hands something to do that wasn't shaking. We tried to watch a movie on my laptop. The desert kept suggesting itself through the windows, a smear of sky, a bleached limb of a Joshua tree, the porch rail making its own fence across nothing. I didn't remember to eat the second half of the sandwich I'd ordered. The swamp cooler sounded like breathing once I'd thought of it that way. When I got into bed, I felt grit under the sheet and panicked, then realized it was the desert's dust and not salt. I brushed it to the floor gently, as if the floor cared how I treated it. At some indecisive hour, 1:12, 2:03, time has corners out there, I heard the particular sound again, the fat tick quiet of granular things resettling, a barely noted rain of scratches. It wasn't a scuttle, it wasn't the assertive busy of an animal, it was patience adjusting itself. I nudged Evan with my knee and he made a sound that meant not now. The wind chime on the porch decided to be still. Far off, the coyotes performed their chorus, and then the silence afterwards seemed to hold their last vowels in its mouth. I told myself every reason for the salt to move, the air we'd let in, the weight of the lid aligning, house settling. The word house felt too formal for a place this small. At 2:47, my phone lit up the room on its own face with a new message from the host. All okay? The question arrived more like a statement of attention than care. I typed, yes, thanks, and backspaced it. I typed quick Q, what's the salt for? And didn't send that either. I got up, moved quiet, and took the ceramic pot from the table to the hatch because some part of me wanted to reset a thing I didn't make. I lifted the runner, slid the cart, breathed the mineral air. Evan said my name like a suggestion from the bed, half asleep and already resigned to me. I sprinkled a soft line along the lid seam, not enough to be dramatic, just a white stitch where concrete met concrete, because I'm simple like that. I believe in stitches. In the morning, the line had shifted, not ruined, shifted, gathered into slow arcs that seemed to lean toward the rung side, pulled not by gravity but choice. The runner had a new, faint crust on its surface, as if the lid had exhaled while I wasn't looking. The cart was still where we'd put it. I checked the wheel smudges like a detective in a movie and hated myself for the part of me that needed to. My coffee tasted like the inside of a seashell. Evan avoided the runner like you avoid an argument you're not ready to have. We didn't leave right away because where do you go from a place you've rented to get away from yourself? There was a logic to staying, and it wore the face of money and time and the effort of packing. I opened the binder again, as if the answer would be thicker in the pages now. The rules were still the rules. The watercolor jackrabbit still stared the way prey animals do, wide as possibility. The page about stars had its own wishfulness. No light pollution. Please enjoy. We had enjoyed nothing about the night, and we both pretended that was fine. Before we left that afternoon, I lifted the hatch one last time because I am not good at leaving things unlooked at. The salt lines below had been edited again. The loops at the ladder's base had spread into thinner, larger ellipses, like the shape a person's path makes when trying to keep the same distance from a center that is moving. The hammock didn't sway. Draftless, the room had gone still. The enamel mug had a crescent of fresh salt clinging to its lip that hadn't been there hours ago. Or it had, and I was making a puzzle out of dust. If you want a reason, I can give you ones that sound reasonable. Desert people do things against insects. The house breathes, air shifts. We misremember. If you want the other kind, I can only tell you how my chest felt right above my heart when the cool air rose, the exact place your shirt holds salt when it dries after sweat. On the drive back to the highway, the light was so clean it made the edges of everything look like intention. For weeks afterward, any time I found a few stray grains on the counter at home, I pressed my fingertip to gather them with the soft pad where your prints are, and I thought of that cool room below ours, a geometry someone else drew that we stepped around, pretended not to understand, and left as neat as we could. I took the soul job because it meant I could put my head down and type for 10 days without anyone asking how I was doing. That's the bargain I make with myself. If I stay useful, I don't have to be interesting. The loft was in Seongsu, a repurposed factory neighborhood that smells like coffee and cutting oil, where the brick warehouses wear new glass and plants in concrete planters soften what used to be edges. The listing hit all my weak points. Keyless entry, climate control you can adjust from your phone, A desk with clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and one long mirrored wall that visually doubled the space so efficient it made my suitcase feel like a mistake. I arrived on a rain-polished evening when the city blinked like a patient machine. Elevators chimed in soothing voices. A girl in the lobby fed her dog a single grape without looking up from her screen. The host, Soo Jin, had messaged me a slick digital booklet with a polite cartoon. "Welcome, please enjoy our smart features." The instructions had a friendly surveillance sheen. How to pair the lights to an app, how to set the blinds to follow sunrise, which QR code opened the garbage room. There was a line near the end I didn't think about until later. Please do not attempt to remove any panels. Hidden sensors are calibrated for comfort and energy efficiency. Inside, the loft smelled like roast beans from the cafe downstairs, and the faint metallic sweetness of new electronics right out of their boxes. On-dull heat made the floor warm under my socks, and a tiny air purifier breathed in a corner with a halo of blue LEDs that promised innocence. The mirrored wall was the north side of the room, glossy and tall, an unbroken panel from floor to ceiling. It didn't have the slight funhouse bow of most mirrors. It held flat in a way that felt like it was asserting itself. I touched it without meaning to. A quick press of fingers like a reflex. No mark. I leaned in and breathed. Nothing fogged. It felt both polite and unwilling to be known. I told myself coatings exist for this. Oleophobic, anti-fog, all the tech words that make modern surfaces behave a little too well. Still, there was a stubborn hum in the room that I registered at the edge of hearing. A thin, out-of-tune note I wanted to think belonged to the purifier or the inverter in the AC. I went around unplugging things to see if it would stop. It didn't. The hum wasn't loud enough to be sound exactly. It was more like the feeling you get wet and a refrigerator motor is running in another room and your ribs do the translation for you. When I pressed my ear near the mirrored wall, the pitch shifted a half step off, then settled back like it had been caught showing emotion and decided it was done. The rest of the loft was simple. Bed by the window, a table just deep enough for a laptop, and a bowl of tangerines the host had left with their stems still on. The bathroom had a vanity mirror separate from the mirror wall, the kind that fogs like a normal mirror, even with a strip of anti-fog in the middle making a little clear window. I think I liked that, the ordinary complication of condensation. I unpacked as if I lived there, set up my keyboard, and tried to fall into the groove I've trained into myself. Hydrate, stretch your wrists, noise-canceling headphones, prestissimo typing like a spell. The hum threaded through the white noise anyway. Outside, traffic made a continuous ribbon sound, and somewhere a scooter burred past, that particular two-stroke irritation that cities all agree to tolerate. From the window, I could see the green glow of a convenience store sign and a woman in a red beanie wiping down a counter with repetitive tenderness. I kept catching my own body in the mirror as I moved. Tiny startles, the way a shadow can be misinterpreted as someone else's. If I turned on the lights to evening in the app, the mirror took the yellow in like honey. If I slid them to presentation, cooler and whiter, the mirror answered with a clinical truth I didn't like. I slept with the blinds down, and the purifier's LEDs turned away. A muted downpour pattered on the window. The hum held, not patient or impatient, just there. It wasn't until morning, when I was brushing my teeth and watching the normal mirror cloud and clear, that I saw it. A hairline gap at the far edge of the mirrored wall, just above the baseboard, the kind of shadow line you can miss for days and then never be able to unsee. The faint suggestion of a seam. When I crouched, a cool thread of air lifted the ankle of my sweatpants like a static touch and let go. I told myself I needed to vacuum. That's how I justified kneeling by the seam with my face close enough to smell the walls cleaner. The app had a robot tile grayed out, promise of a gadget that didn't exist, and that made me laugh in a short, unkind way. I ran my fingernail along the baseboard where the mirrored panel met the floor. There was the smallest chamfer, a precision gap that belonged to something engineered. Above it, close to knee height, my nail bumped a shallow oval, just a lack of paint that suggested a recessed pull, an intake for a fingertip that didn't want to be found unless you were already looking. I should have messaged the host then, I know that. Instead, I slid my finger in and tugged. The panel didn't swing like a door. It moved a few millimeters, stopped, then grudgingly surrendered with a sigh that I felt more than heard. The hum sharpened, the note unmasking its source like a bad magician. Cold air rolled a thin sheet along the floor, smelling not of dirt or damp, but of slightly ionized nothing. A server room breath, cleaned and recirculated to death. Behind the rail-thin opening was a space that didn't belong to domestic life. My phone's light scattered itself on surfaces too close and too parallel for comfort. A corridor just wide enough for a human body turned sideways, skinned in unpainted concrete board and the matte backs of panels that made my living space behave. Wiring harnesses ran in neat bundles at shin height, zip-tied like patients, disappearing into junction boxes with labels in tidy Korean I couldn't read. A shallow metal grate formed a walkway. The effect was surgical, service without service workers, as if the building had chosen discretion as an aesthetic. Pinpoints of something punctured the back of the mirrored wall at irregular intervals, a scatter of holes no bigger than the head of a pin. They were not evenly spaced. They were where your eye would be if your face were, say, 5'10" and turned a little toward a bed, where your eye would be if you were 5'2" and curious about a desk. When I shifted the phone's beam just right, I could look through one and see my own loft, doubled tiny in a circle. The unmade bed, a tangerine untouched, the far window bright with morning. The unease that ran through me then wasn't cinematic. It was practical, an assessment of angles, how much could be seen from here and how easily. Dust lay evenly on the grate except where it didn't. The interruptions were not good. They weren't heel-to-toe prints like you'd expect if someone had walked through in shoes. They were comma marks, paired crescents that repeated with a rhythm just wrong for human gait. Too equidistant, too careful, as if the point of contact were soft and rounded at both ends with a notch where a toe should be. Between each pair sometimes was a faint third line, a drag or a balance point, a slender kiss of something being lifted mostly but not entirely between steps. I want to tell you that my brain cataloged and explained. It did the cheap stuff, cleaning crew, maintenance, odd footwear, and then ran out of generosity. At elbow height, the corridor had a scuff that made sense to me, the kind of smeared drywall gets when a body has to turn sideways, and the shoulder that has known too many narrow spaces takes a rub without thinking. There were other signs of people being people in small ways. An elastic hair tie, brittle with dust, caught around a conduit, a single flattened paper cup wedged beneath the grate like it had skittered and been retrieved impatiently and missed. Farther along toward the end where the corridor would curve back along the window, there was a panel that must open into the building's spine, painted a neutral no color that all Barshoria seek of house doors wear. On it, written in Sharpie that had bled into the paint a little, were 3 characters I could not read. Later, scrolling through a dictionary, I found them and wished I hadn't. Sum, breath, or hide. Korean is efficient that way. One shape allowed to carry weight in 2 directions, both true. I found myself measuring the distance between the pinholes with my eyes, triangulating where they would put a viewer in relation to the bed. It made me feel mechanical and cheap. My palms had started to sweat and the phone light jittered in a repeating loop that made the shadows do a tiny strobe. I listened then because I had to. The hum had companions in here, tiny harmonics that made a chord nobody asked for. Beneath it all, a faint, out-of-time tapping played like someone wearing soft, not-quite shoes testing each grate panel's give with the patience of a metronome and then stopping, as if they knew exactly when I would lean in to listen. I didn't go farther. There is a physics to fear, angles and surfaces and the weight of air. Sideways I backed out, my belt catching on the recessed pull with an undramatic tug that felt stupidly intimate. The mirror panel sealed itself with a little insistence once most of me was on the sensible side. The seam reassumed the posture of being just what it was supposed to be, a reflection that wanted nothing from anyone. It made me feel like the kind of person who believes unconvincingly that a towel under a door will stop smoke. I wrote to the host with my thumbs too fast. Hi, there seems to be an access corridor behind the mirrored wall. It slid open a little when I was cleaning. Is that normal? The app put a soothing gradient behind my concern, like it could please the edges of the words into better behavior. I hovered over the send arrow, and because I am not as brave as I want to be, I softened it. No worries if so. Just wanted to check I didn't mess anything up. Her reply came with a promptness that felt like habit. Yes, there is a maintenance plenum with climate sensors. Please do not open for your safety. No cameras are installed, just temperature and humidity. Thank you for being careful. She put a smiling emoji after humidity that looked like it had never worried about anything in its life. I stared at the phrase, no cameras, like it was a breadcrumb. The words were technically generous. How often does anyone deny a thing that precisely? But the pinholes were still in my wall and the dust had a record of traffic that my fingers didn't know how to argue with. I tried to be sensible. The mirrored wall might not smudge because it was sealed. The hum might be a transformer that liked to sing off key. People who service buildings wear all kinds of shoes. Those prints could have belonged to split-toe boots, tabby style, or to slippers the cleaning crew keeps in a locker and never thinks about until it's time to put them on. Maybe the tapping I thought I heard was the ductwork equalizing after I'd messed with the airflow. The word plenum is so dull it could smother anything with logic if you let it. Still, my body betrayed me. I moved the bed 3 inches farther from the wall, a ridiculous distance that meant nothing to anyone but my nervous system. I slid the low table in front of the seam, which couldn't possibly stop a panel designed to move but made me feel like I had contributed. The mirrored wall did its job and kept everything spacious and light. It ate my gestures without chewing. That night, I turned the app's lights down to off and then turned a lamp back on, unable to tolerate my own reflection in so much black. Sleep was a negotiation. The rain had gone, replaced by the city's soft insomnia. Somewhere a truck reversed with a beep that sounded kind. I was just dropping when the hum shifted as though something somewhere. He took a breath and held it. Then a small sound that I can only describe by saying it reminded me of a fingertip testing the skin of a balloon. Just that tiny stick slip and release. Not loud, close, a beat, then nothing. When I finally slept, it did not last. I woke at 3:23 to the sense that a shape in the room had changed by an unhelpful degree. The mirror does not record change the way walls do. It reports. In the morning light, ordinary and indecent, I noticed a thin arc of dullness on the glass at about shoulder height, a crescent so faint it might have been a trick of angle. I touched it. No texture, no powder to gather, nothing to prove that anything had brushed there but the map of my breath. I cupped my hands to peer, the childish way you do against aquarium glass, and felt foolish. Inside the curve of my shade, at one of the pinhole's positions, the tiniest gleam of the loft stared back. My face framed in a coin, bizarrely far, absurd. I jerked back, embarrassed with no one to see. I ate from the convenience store out of a reflex for normality. Triangles of kimbap I couldn't finish, coffee in a can too sweet to be coffee. I worked because that's the one thing I can do inside any geometry and pretend it's enough. When I walked to the bathroom, I timed my steps away from the mirror like I was pretending not to watch a stranger on the subway. The word "some" looped in my head, not quite a lullaby. Breathe. Hide. I started to test myself the way a person tests a tooth that hurts, one fingertip at the seam when I passed, as if to reassure both of us that we were staying in our lanes. On the last night, the hum came back with a second note that either wasn't there before or I'd earned the right to hear. I messaged the host again. Is there a schedule for maintenance in the plenum? Just so I'm not surprised. The app showed delivered, then read, then a pause long enough to make me feel juvenile. Reply. No scheduled access during stays. Please let us know if you hear excessive noise. The word excessive did a lot of work for her and none for me. I set the blinds to open at sunrise because it felt like a promise I could hold the building to, then lay on my side and watched my own outline in the mirror refuse to become a stranger. In the morning, the table I'd put in front of the seam had shimmied a centimeter skewed. The Ondol heat warps things. That's probably true. A single tangerine, the one I hadn't eaten, had rolled toward the mirror and come to rest against the baseboard with unreasonable patience. I put it back in the bowl, then put it in my bag instead, like someone who believes in talismans, when the rational thing would be to let fruit be fruit. Before I left, I pressed my palm flat against the mirrored wall as if to feel its temperature, and found it unexpectedly cool, as if the glass had been in a different room all night, one where the air never had to decide whether to be for a person. I checked out like a good guest. Dishes washed, towels piled, lights off. In the elevator, the polite voice wished me a happy day. Outside, Soul unfurled its million tiny transactions, each with a sound. For weeks afterward, any unmoving hum threaded its way to the back of my teeth, and any mirror too perfect made the skin between my shoulder blades feel awake. I still catch myself glancing at the edges of glass in unfamiliar rooms, an old habit making itself a home, looking for a gap that refuses to be more than a hair in a reflected life that doesn't involve mine. I chose the Edinburgh place because the photos looked like a museum of restraint. High ceilings, tall sash windows, a mantel with nothing on it but a clock that didn't keep time. The listing used words like heritage and sympathetic, and I let those words do a kind of work I didn't want to. The townhouse was in the new town, a terrace of soot-scrubbed Georgian facades, doors painted serious colors with brass that remembered hands. Rain fell in the way it falls there. Smear, locals call it. So fine you can walk through it pretending you're not getting wet, and then you realize you are. The stairwell smelled of cold stone and someone else's dinner. My bag thumped up 2 flights, hand on the rope of a banister burnished to a softness my skin recognized immediately. The host was called Isla, and she messaged in that breezy, polite way that disguises an iron expectation. So glad you've arrived. The flat can be chilly at first. Radiators are on a timer. Please do not adjust the hearth valves. Delicate. And kindly avoid touching the wallpaper in the front room. It's a reproduction and marks easily. Let me know if you need anything at all. There was a period at the end of that last sentence, not an exclamation point, and I noticed it because I noticed those things. The front room, the one with the mantel clock, had been dressed as a sitting room in the photos, but in person it read as something else, a space with its own posture. The wallpaper did the talking, cream ground, a repeating pattern of thistles and tiny birds in flight, all pale greens and plummy lines fine as thread. It was the kind of print that wants to be a backdrop to a polite life. But the seams betrayed it. In one corner, the bird's wings didn't quite meet where they should have. The vines climbed and then slipped by half an inch, like the paper had been hung to fit a line that the room thought it knew, and the room was wrong. I told myself it was old plaster and earnest work, doing their best in a room too square to be truly square. The radiators had that Victorian impatience where they take a while and then overdo it. The air in the room was layered, the top of my body warm, my ankles cold. Outside the window, the city slid past in sound without moving. Buses sighing, heels on stone, a gull keening like a complaint it could never quite phrase. The mantel clock had a key in it, but when I tried to wind it, the spring refused to take. I put the key down and noticed the faintest scuff on the wainscoting below the papered wall, like something had bumped there repeatedly at a height that cleared the chair rails. I didn't register the humming at first. It was in the range that hides behind other things, pipes, the city's quiet, my own breath. It had a shape, though, a rhythm that made me think of someone trying to soothe themselves and not quite succeeding. I chased it to the wall by accident, crouching to plug in my computer by the skirting board. There, the cold was particular. It wasn't the chill of a poorly sealed window or a draft under a door. It was a pocketed cold, the sort that keeps its own counsel and arrives from a small place on purpose. I went to put my palm flat against the wallpaper to see if the radiator had warmed it, then remembered Isla's line and stopped, fingers hovering. The paper had that slight sheen good paper has, the kind that would show oil from hands if you weren't careful. I looked for the source of the cold instead. Along the baseboard, at the corner where the thistles didn't line up, the paper didn't sit flush. A little tent of air lifted it, the tiniest swell like a breath under a blanket. I told myself this was normal. The way you tell yourself a fine crack in a ceiling is a conversation between materials, not a sentence. By the window, the condensation made beads of mercury along the sash. The room smelled faintly of starch paste and lemon oil, scents that feel like good intentions. I set my book on the chair, pretended to read, and listened without looking like I was listening. The humming did not belong to any neighbor I could excuse. It was too close and too contained. It habitually started, then would falter. 2 notes repeated, a hum and drop, like a lullaby someone half remembered and then relearned wrong. I told myself there were pipes in the wall. This is how they talk when heat moves through old veins. The pattern of thistles climbed, and the seam where they slipped felt like a word mispronounced and then left that way. By late afternoon, the radiators had done their temperamental job, and I had lost the argument with my own patience. I found a clean tea towel in the kitchen, folded it into a square, and brought it back to the front room like a peace offering I could use to save the paper from my touch. I pressed the towel gently against the spot where the seam went astray, as if I could nudge the birds back into their flight path. The paper gave under the pressure, not in the brittle way of old paste letting go, but softly, with a yield that felt alive. The feeling startled me. I pulled back and my body waited for the resistance of stone or brick or wood. What met me instead was something like damp plaster left in a bag too long, a give that remembered your hand. The humming thickened at the edge of hearing and then cut out as if it disliked my attention. That was when I saw the pin, a tiny brass head shoved flush where the vines curl around a thistle at chair rail height. It didn't match the rest of the room's hardware, and it held the edge of the wallpaper taut the way you pin fabric before you sew. For a second I saw the paper as clothing, the room as a patient. I slid the pin free. The paper sprang a breath's width from the wall. At the seam, a loose corner lifted, a dog ear that had been tucked well and wanted out. I shouldn't have. You have to believe me that I know I shouldn't have. But the cold had intent, and the seam was a mouth. I eased the corner back enough to see. Underneath, the print changed. The pattern below was older, foxed and browned with time. The colors more saturated where they had been denied light. Children's scenes, not thistles, a repetition of small boats in a row and a dog with a ribbon that ran under them all, a border that hadn't been designed to match anything in the world I live in. The scalpel straight line of something else ran vertical beneath, an outline crisp as a rule, architrave, my brain supplied, because the frame beneath had been painted around at least once, and paint knows how to show its history. I pulled the paper back a little further, the tea towel protecting it like an apology that wouldn't matter if I wanted to give it later. Beneath, someone had made a door ordinary-sized people would recognize as a door, and then had decided to pretend it wasn't one. The edge of the frame was there, paint built up in a margin thick enough to be counted in years. A keyhole had been filled, puttied flush and painted the color of whatever era had claimed it. The putty had cracked in a circle like earth after drought. I ran my fingernail along the crack, and it gave the way a scab gives when you shouldn't pick it. At the level of my thigh, the paint had an odd softness it had no right to. It was as if the wall had absorbed moisture from within for longer than anyone checked on it. My fingertip pressed in, and an oval remained, shallow, like the first half of a thumbprint. I had a dizzy sense of touching a bruise that belonged to someone else. I found the edge of the chair rail and slid my hand along until it met a narrow recess, a carpenter's consideration cut 100 and some years ago to accommodate a latch. The latch wasn't there. My nail caught, though, on a gap too straight to be accident. I worried it until it widened enough to take the dull blade of a butter knife from the kitchen. The blade slipped into the seam, then caught, then found a cousin metal hidden in the paint, some long painted-over piece that remembered being a handle. I levered gently, and something inside yielded with a sigh I felt through the bones of my hand. The frame had been bricked up, that was clear now, a skin of bricks under a skin of paint and paper. But the bricks weren't what I expected. They weren't hard. The first push of the knife made a dent. My ribs tightened. There's a smell to old mortar, chalk, and damp. This was cleaner, stranger. My second push met less resistance, and the dent rippled outward as if I'd pressed into a cake that hadn't set. I told myself it was some Victorian ingenuity, horsehair and lime wash, a trick of substrate and paste that would make sense to a tradesman and not to me. The humming returned, closer. A thread pulled tight and pulled again. When I widened the gap enough to look through, the temperature on my face changed sharply. The room beyond held on to cold like it had been waiting to share. My breath made a little cloud, and I watched it disperse in a space I wasn't yet inside. I tilted my head, one eye, then both, and the view arranged itself. A small room, low-ceilinged, the proportions wrong for the Georgian sense of self I'd stepped into from the street. A cot sat along the far wall, iron painted white and then yellow, and then white again, flaked like the edge of a seashell. A blanket lay folded once, thick wool gone thin at the corners. On the floor, a braided rug made of fabric strips faded to a harmony of grays. The wallpaper inside had its own life. Tiny boats and the dependable dog on a ribbon, the same border I'd found under my seam. The border ran around and around. Loyal. The rocking horse stood in the center, not the glossy red-lipped kind you see in antique shops. This one was quieter, wood pale with age, mane carved and not hair, paint worn off at the handle where small hands had smoothed it. It rocked. Slowly. The kind of motion rooms keep long after instigation if you want to be kind. The sort of motion a building shelters for a child who got up a moment ago if you let your mind go there. A mobile hung from the ceiling, card cutouts of moons and fish, their edges browned, moving less than the horse, but not moving. Sound in that room was muffled, not thick, just not interested in going far. The humming had no origin. It was as if the walls themselves had retained the idea of soothing, and it could be coaxed from them with a little air. I did not go inside. That feels important to say plain. I extended my arm the length of the butter knife through the softened seam, just enough to unlatch a feeling I couldn't name, and then I stood there with my hand on the frame as if holding a child at a curb. My body had its own logic, and it did not agree with my mind's cataloging. The cold rolled along my forearm like a sleeve up to the elbow and then stopped in a precise line. The horse kept its slow insistence. I wanted very badly for a radiator to clank, for a bus to breathe, for some external sound to come and tell me I was surrounded by things I could name. I put the knife down and went to find my phone, because asking permission after the fact is a habit I haven't shed. Hi, Isla. There seems to be an old door under the wallpaper in the front room. The paper was lifting at the base, so I checked and noticed a frame. The wall feels soft in one spot. Is there a maintenance cavity or something there? I added the or something because I wanted to sound reasonable. It took an indulgent minute for her to reply. Ah, yes, that would be the old nursery. It has been sealed for many years. There is no access from the flat for safety reasons. Please, if the paper has lifted, would you mind pinning it back? There are drawing pins in the kitchen drawer. Thank you for letting me know. She didn't answer the part of my message that I thought was the heart of it. I read it again to see if I was the one who'd misaimed. The phrase sealed felt like a choice. I fetched the pins and the tea towel and tried to make my brief mistake less visible. The paper had changed shape with its freedom and didn't want to go back the way it had lain. It bubbled as I smoothed it, air refusing to commit to the places I tried to send it. I pinned at the pattern's edge with hands that wanted to shake and told myself I was practicing care with something that deserved it. I pressed the seam where the chair rail met the disguised architrave and felt the soft give again, a small bowing, like a gentle animal turning its head away from your hand. Night makes old rooms elastic. The flat put its warm out into the cold and then wanted it back. The humming took a positional role as soon as light narrowed. It moved as I moved, or maybe I perceived it differently as I changed distance. I ate in the kitchen, toast and cheddar and a tomato sliced on the diagonal because my grandmother did that, and I trusted my grandmother. I carried my plate to the front room because the chair there made me feel like I had inherited a calm I hadn't earned. The rocking horse wasn't in my line of sight. It might as well have been. The room's geometry had been rearranged in my head, and no amount of not looking made the new angles unoccur. Sometime after midnight, 2:08 by my phone, which felt overly precise, I woke with the impression that someone had just finished speaking in the room beyond. Not words, exactly. The shape of words pressed into the air. The radiator valves ticked in tiny corrections. The humming, soft as breath, came and went in a repeat that was not quite a rhythm, like the body of whoever hummed was tired and the hum had to start over. I lay with my hand on the duvet and counted heartbeats until I lost count, then got up because lying still felt like pretending. In the front room, the wallpaper looked exactly as I had left it, except I knew it hadn't. One of the drawing pins sat on the skirting board, its brass head a dot of decision against white. It hadn't fallen far. It had fallen with purpose, like a small hand had removed it and put it down where I'd be sure to see. The seam was no wider than before. The cold at the base of the wall felt slightly less patient, more direct. I pressed the pin back because ceremony matters, pushed it through paper into whatever sat behind, and there was that soft give again and the sense that I had pinned something that had been trying to move on its own time. I told myself everything I could live with. Old houses keep their cold in pockets. A sealed room with no heat source will pull warmth like gravity steals light. The rocking horse would move if the floor moved, and floors do move, under footsteps, under heat. The humming lives in pipes where they cross with intention from one century to the next. I told myself I might have breathed on the horse and set it going and didn't notice because I was busy transgressing. The idea that something could be preserved perfectly by neglect is a lie we tell when we want to keep the shape of a past without its weight. I am not immune to that. I slept finally toward morning, the way a person sleeps in a quiet theater when the lights are down and their body is grateful for a darkness it understands. When I woke, light had drawn a rectangle on the floor like a promise, and the clock on the mantel still refused to keep it. I made tea and set the cup down on the chair arm and saw the faintest grit on the saucer rim, a circle of dust too fine to be the city's ordinary sediment. Architectural dust has a taste. It is lime and memory. I licked my finger and it wasn't that. Salt would be too neat for this story. It wasn't salt. It was something chalkier and older and immediately gone on the tongue. Before I left, I did the thing I do now, which is to put my palm where I shouldn't and ask a surface for its temperature. The spot near the baseboard was not as cold as it had been, but it had a complexity that made me feel foolish for touching it, like putting your hand on someone's back while they're crying when they haven't asked you to. I took the last drawing pin and pressed it in where the bird's wings didn't meet and then stepped back. It held, a neat metallic head on a repeat. Isla texted at checkout. Trust all was comfortable. I typed, yes, thank you. There's a little lift at the base of the paper, but I pinned it. The front room feels special. I deleted that last sentence 3 times before I sent it and then let it go half-formed anyway. She replied with a thumbs up and a note about bins. For weeks after, any lullaby in a film made my throat ache, and any wallpaper seam made me watch whether patterns met at the corners like they had learned their lines or slid by each other the way people do in old rooms when they're trying to be polite and cannot. We booked the A-frame because the photos made the lake look like a mirror with manners. Off-season Minnesota, late September, the leaves not quite committed to being dramatic yet. The listing said lakeside, kayaks free to use, wood stove for ambiance only, and a tongue-in-cheek note about loons you might mistake for ghosts. I laughed when I read it because I wanted to be the kind of person who thinks loons are charming, not a warning about the particular noise loneliness makes. The place smelled like cedar and damp wool, triangular windows stacked the way triangles do, doubling the surface where sky could get in. A steel thermos sat on the counter beside a mason jar of matches and a binder labeled cabin notes in blocky label maker text. The first page was a welcome from Marla Hank with a photo of 2 smiling people in camo hats I wouldn't have guessed made ambiance their word. House rules were ordinary, except for a line boxed in highlighter. Please do not remove any blue painter's tape. Ongoing project. Feel free to add a small piece if you notice a draft or creak. Thank you. There were little squares of tape included, stuck to the inside of the plastic sleeve like stamps. I didn't think about it until I kept seeing the tape. It was everywhere and nowhere, casual, provisional. A half-inch on the edge of a window mullion with no crack to announce itself. A torn strip on a baseboard where the nail holes already felt honest. A piece under the loft ladder rung like someone had wanted their foot to remember a place. One at the kitchen outlet cover pointing at nothing. Two on the ceiling beam above the loft bed, parallel and close, like quotation marks. That last one bothered me without a reason I could defend. My brother came with me, which I'd like to claim was for company more than history. Cal is the kind of person who looks for studs in a wall by knocking as if he'll hear the truth if he's polite enough. He took the binder and read it like a test. "Ha!" he said, tapping the note about tape. "Contractor's treasure map." He put his palm over a piece near the sliding door and nodded as if the air under his hand had confessed. The loft bed had been tucked under the ridge beam, and climbing up made you feel like a kid choosing a top bunk. The beam over the bed made its own horizon line across the slanted ceiling, dark with hand oil and the patina of years. The twin strips of blue tape there were small but purposeful, torn to neat rectangles rather than ripped ragged. When I lay back and looked up, they were dead center over where a head would be. The lake had that particular quiet that isn't quiet. Wet sound carries. The slap of water on rocks. A far chainsaw lacing the edge of the afternoon. We put logs in the wood stove and watched them not be allowed to be fire. The loons did their part, a lonely ululation that made my skin admit I hadn't been as brave about being away from people as I pretended. The A-frame thunked and ticked like warm wood does when outside asks it to choose a size. Every house breathes. This one hummed more like it cleared its throat. At dinner, Cal found another piece of tape on the underside of the table, a deliberate corner-to-corner X. "That's just someone's sense of humor," he said, eyebrows up. We ate chili from a pot and let the cabin tell us where to put our bowls when we were done. By the time we turned off the main lights and left the little lamp over the sink to be gentle, I had cataloged 13 pieces of tape without meaning to. I kept telling myself I liked that. Evidence of care, of ongoing attention. The tape read like notes to a future self in a language I didn't quite know. When the loft went dark, the parallel strips over the bed blinked as the clock on the stove down below cycled its colon. The blue had a way of answering the green. The beam over my head expanded with a soft knock, and I pretended it was the kind of knock you get when a friend arrives at an agreed-upon time and stands outside waiting for you to say, "Come in." The tape didn't move. It held its neat silence like a small, reasonable refusal. I didn't mean to touch the tape over the bed. It was one of those small compulsions your fingers act on before your brain decides if it's rude. In the morning, I reached up, expecting the adhesive to feel tired and papery. It was firm. The edge snapped up with a noise that was too loud in the triangle of the loft. An inch of sound that made Cal look up from his coffee with the resigned patience of a person who grew up with me. "Don't start," he said, but he didn't mean it. Under the piece of tape, the beam had a shallow oval I hadn't seen. A finger recess, the kind of hardware you put your hand in if you know it's there. It had been sanded flush and stained over 100 times until it looked like the wood's own decision. My fingertip fit. A hidden latch likes the person who isn't supposed to know it exists, or maybe that's just my projection. When I pulled, the section of ceiling to the right of the beam gave a quarter inch and then lifted with the stiff reluctance of something that had been held closed by habit. A small panel swung up on a piano hinge and caught on a friction arm. Cold slid down my forearm from the cavity like a creature that wanted out and then decided to stay. We both peered. The space beyond the panel ran the length of the eaves, a narrow crawlway hemmed in by foil-faced insulation and the back sides of tongue-and-groove planks. A shallow plank catwalk sat on the bottom cords of the rafters, wide enough to put a foot sideways and not much more. Where the roof met the interior, slim rectangular openings cut through, slit vents, 3 fingers wide and longer than a hand, each one aimed into the living space at very deliberate angles. One pointed at the loft bed's pillow, another toward the couch below, a third lined up with the dining table where we'd eat and pretend to be civilized. They weren't ducts. They weren't the kind of vents that carry air for a reason you can call a code inspector about. They were sightlines wearing practicality like a disguise. Dust had a priestly way with this place. It lay in even gray until it had a story to tell. On the catwalk boards were patches rubbed into smooth arcs the width of the heel of a hand. Near the slits, at the edge where wood met opening, the dust had been wiped away in thin crescents that could have been the drag of fingers testing the angle, each arc ending in a tiny tear of clean wood where a nail splinter had pulled its skin. Old, I told myself. Old and done. On the rafter to the right there was a set of 4 parallel marks, as soft as breath, like someone had set their fingertips there and thought better of the rest of their weight. The foil-faced insulation carried thumbprints the way foil paper does, shallow dimples that refused to unhappen. "Mouse guy's worst nightmare," Cal said, performing competence. He tapped the catwalk with the side of his knuckle, and the sound came back specific, too thin to be structure, too resonant to be not. He leaned in farther than I liked, and I held the back of his shirt without admitting why. He reached to one of the slits and angled his eye to it the way you take a peek down a sight you don't want to fire. "You could see everything," he said, quiet, then laughed, because if you don't laugh at that sentence, it sits in the room with you. The air from inside the crawlway wasn't the cold of outside. It was stale cool, a held breath temperature. I put my face near the opening and smelled cedar and something else. Old dust that comes from hands, not just wood. The faint sweetness skin leaves when it wants to be forgiven for existing. In the far distance of the crawlway, a shape promised a bend. The A-frame's perimeter is stubborn geometry. This space obeyed it with a kind of intimacy that made me feel like we'd burst in on 2 people mid-conversation. We put the panel back because pretending we hadn't found it felt like a kind of safety. Why? The blue tape went over the recess again with an indifference I envied. We went outside and launched the kayaks because water is a language I actually read. A loon surfaced too close and put its red eye on us like a coin you flip to make a decision you've already made. The day did a respectable job being day. When we came back at dusk, cold moved in like a neighbor who knows your routine without being invited. We boiled pasta and failed to salt it enough. Cal stretched out on the couch with a book he wasn't reading, and I climbed the loft ladder and lay on my back because after you discover a seam, ceilings refuse to be just ceilings. The blue tape above my head was obedient. And then, all at once, it wasn't the tape that moved. It was the sense of room. No drama, just a shift, the way a house feels different in the instant between wind and not. I don't know what sound I thought I heard first, the smallest drag like skin across dusty wood, or the click of something placing weight where weight had been before. Maybe I imagined both because once a thought has entered a room, it lays tracks. I got the lamp on and Cal was already climbing the ladder, his book still in his hand like he'd brought courage by accident. We opened the panel because we are not good at leaving the cat in the bag. The crawlway looked exactly as it had, which is to say like itself, which is worse somehow. Only this. The thin crescents of white dust near the slit over the pillow were cleaner than before, like a fresh finger had reminded the wood of its own grain. I put my hand next to the marks, and it was obvious my fingers were longer and spaced differently. The arcs on the catwalk near the hinge had a darker gray threaded through them now, damp stillness making the dust clump in a fine line the way breath does on a cold window for a second before it dries. I messaged the host because accountability is what I do when I can't explain a feeling. "Hi Marla, wanted to check about the blue tape on the beam in the loft. There's a small access panel there. It opened when I was dusting. Is that okay?" The little typing dots did their lonesome dance for a while. Her reply came bright. "Hi. Oh yes, that's just the attic crawl. Please keep it closed. Mouse traps and insulation. Itchy. The blue tape marks a draft line. Our contractor will address. Thanks so much." I stared at the words draft line. I had not known drafts moved in lines until then. I lay awake on the loft bed with the panel shut and the tape retaped and a mug of tea going cold on the floor because the mug knew what to do without me. The house made its conversation with the night. Tick, breathe, small replies. Cal went outside to piss because he likes the shape his breath makes in cold air, came back and said he'd heard a soft knocking behind the wall like a squirrel with manners. "It's nothing," he said, because someone had to. The beam over us looked suddenly like strategy, the blue tape too neat for what it was pretending to mean. Just before 3, in the precise way that is either a trick of a digital clock or a mercy from the universe making sure you can't lie about the time later, I woke to a sound I had already been awake inside. The light from the stove clock limned the ladder and the top of Cal's shoulder where he'd fallen asleep wrong downstairs. I could hear the sock foot drag of my own pulse in my ears, and beneath it, the smallest wet sound, the one you hear when someone lifts their hand from a damp windowsill and the print stays behind. Not loud. In a triangle, everything sounds closer. I didn't move for a long time, which made moving inevitable. When I eased the panel open, the hinge gave me its tiny metal exhale and then held. The crawlway air was cool, as if the space itself had leaned toward the outside and brought some honesty back. The dust near the slit above the pillow had been edited. You know how a fresh print looks when your skin is clean and the surface isn't? Not greasy, not dirty, just wet enough to make the dry articulate. 4 ovals, parallel, rounded and close, and the hint of a fifth that didn't quite commit. They held the shape of a hand except not, too narrow at the palm, the spacing not quite human. The arcs I'd seen earlier had been softened by this new insistence. The foil-faced insulation opposite wore the suggestion of a pressure point that had been and wasn't anymore, a shallow dish that didn't know how to unremember. I put my hand beside the marks again because I am not good at learning the first time. My fingers looked clumsy. The print did not line up. It was almost a relief, like a diagnosis you didn't want that at least gets you out of being blamed. I closed the panel because I wanted the panel closed in the same way you want your mouth closed when someone peels the tape off your lips. The blue tape went back with a tired sound, the soft chew of adhesive meeting the exact surface it left. Morning insists on being reasonable. The lake wore its mild sun like a clean shirt. Marla texted again, unprompted. Just a reminder, please don't move any of the blue tape, even if it's tempting. It helps our guy find things. Smile emoji. I typed, sorry about that, one piece came loose. We set it back. All good. I deleted the part of the sentence where I wanted to ask about the slits and didn't. She sent a thumbs up and a note about checkout times. The day had coffee taste and a wind that made the little triangle of docks seem like a thought a person had and then changed their mind about. We stayed the last night out of an economy that had nothing to do with money. We shifted the pillow down the bed as if an extra 6 inches were a strategy. Cal suggested we sleep downstairs, and I said the couch was too short, like he didn't know that already. The panel stayed shut. The blue tape stayed blue. The sounds were the same as ever. The vents, we called them that by then because names keep things in their lanes, exhaled nothing. More prints did not announce themselves in a way we could clock without going looking. Going looking had become the problem. On the drive away, the cabin got small and the mirror too fast. The wind pushed the pines toward it like they were telling it a secret we weren't supposed to hear. Weeks later, I went into a hardware store to buy nothing important and stood for too long in the aisle with the tapes. Masking, painters, gaffer, colors that mean nothing until you let them. I touched the edge of a roll of blue, and the tack of it came away on my finger, a clean, polite glue that promises temporary. I wiped my hand on my jeans like I'd touched something I should leave alone. If you want me to be sensible, I can be, for most people, most days. Draft lines exist. Contractors use tape to mark ceiling joists, seams, squeaks you can fix with shims and screws. That crawlway could be about airflow and not attention. Dust will tell the story you ask it to if you give it enough time. Ask me in a different tone and I'll tell you how soft those ovals were, how they kept their shape long enough to be argument and then faded into ordinary gray. Ask me when I'm tired and I'll say the part that sticks is how the A-frame felt. A human-sized thought held between two long planes, and the knowledge that someone, something, had set their weight with care right where my head would be, as if to see if sleeping means what it used to. I booked the mountain place because I wanted altitude to iron me flat. That was the phrase in my head. Even if it doesn't make sense. Go high enough and the air gets thin, the choices get few, and all you can do is breathe and sleep and look at trees. The listing was bright with angles, a modern chalet outside of Fairplay, black steel and blonde wood, too much window for someone who lives feeling watched. Gas stove, radiant floors, a closet full of extra blankets. Mountain quiet, the host, Gabe wrote. You'll hear the house more than the neighbors. I wanted to be alone with a house that would confess itself first. The drive took the kind of turns you measure by how your stomach learns them. Lodgepole pines stood with the tolerant attention of things that have survived worse. Snow sketched itself into the edges of everything without committing. The chalet's key code worked like a charm, and I liked that I didn't have to perform gratitude for a stranger right then. Inside, the smell was new wood and something faintly ionic, ozone from baseboards, and the whisper a heated slab makes when it remembers it's warmer than the air above it. The view was an arrangement of distances, a meadow with sage in its shoulder blades, a darker band of trees, a mountain whose snow line looked like someone had drawn it with a pencil that kept breaking and then working again. Gabe's binder had a laminated mountain goat on the first page and a tone that wanted to be helpful without being in the way. Bears, lock the bin, altitude, drink water, move slow, fireplace, vent first, please. There was a line about storage. Utility closets are marked. Please don't access. A softer note about the neighbor's dog who may wander and is friendly but opinionated. I walked the perimeter like I always do. Check the doors, lift the blinds, look for the weirdness that isn't in the photos. The bedroom had a wide, low bed with a plaid throw that made me feel like I was starring in a catalog page about the idea of rest. The closet was generous. Extra quilts in a stack, a folded camp cot, a plastic bin labeled winter with a marker that had almost given up. I felt the flex before I saw anything. Stepping into the closet to hang my coat, the floor under the right side gave a fraction, then made a sound not unlike a lid thinking about being itself. Not loud, just a tiny click with intention. A small mechanical yes you could mistake for one of the building's private noises, and then not. I laughed a little because I couldn't help it. There's a kind of person who hears a click and thinks, oh, I was invited. I am that kind. Kneeling, I ran my fingers along the baseboard. The gap between wood and wall was tight everywhere except in one corner, where a shadow line made itself known if you angled your head. The closet shelf bracket above cast a shape that almost hit it, but not quite. My knuckle found a circle, flush, painted over, like the ghost of a finger pull. The paint around it had a hairline fracture radiating in a perfect little star that didn't belong to accident. I told myself, trapdoor for plumbing, crawl space access, attention to maintenance I should applaud and ignore. When I pressed again just to confirm it was a seam and not my expectation, the dryness of the air ran along the backs of my teeth. Altitude draws all your liquids out and offers you clarity as a trade. The floor issued another small sound, a second, more intimate click, as if answering a question I hadn't yet asked. The slab under the living room hummed its even, safe warmth. The closet kept its own counsel. The afternoon thinned toward that particular mountain blue that wants to be dark and then changes its mind and glows once for no reason I'm owed. I set my bag by the bed. I told myself I would unpack first. Tea, eat something, be sensible. The seam sat there and did not do anything, which is how most decisions begin. It didn't take much. The pat of my thumb in the circle, a careful lift, and the closet floor separated from itself with the gentleness of paper ungluing after a long time. Hinges I couldn't see were there anyway, a precision hinge that let the panel rise without scraping the paint. A soft draft exhaled up, cool and accurate, smelling of old concrete in the inside of aluminum. The heat from the main room sighed toward the ceiling, as if to leaving me to choose. A ladder waited, the kind built in, rails painted to match the closet, steps worn to a satin by hands rather than shoes. I lowered my head and shoulders and let my phone light declare a perimeter. The space below was not a crawlspace improvisation, but a room, a little bunker made of cinder block and insistence, tucked under the bedroom like a secret the house kept without malice. The floor was poured and painted a gray that had been glossy once and had scuffed into something matte with time. Someone had decided that this was a place to last in. On the far wall, a corkboard took up the width of the room, its edges cut to avoid the electrical panel with a courtesy that made me trust the person who did it. Pinned there were USGS quads, the old paper kind that fold like reluctant money, corners rounded, north arrows with style. Red pencil traced certain roads and crossed them out. Blue grease pencil circled springs and annotated in block letters in a hand that belonged to someone who had eaten their neatness for breakfast. Dates in the margins ranged from 1982 to 1999, a line here and there more recent, written with a different pencil, lighter. A length of string connected a circle labeled tank to another marked switchback, and I recognized both from my drive without having known I was memorizing anything. An olive drab radio sat crooked on a wire shelf below the board, the kind with a handset coiled like a stubborn idea and a push-to-talk button that suggested control to whoever held it. No brand I recognize, just a worn, stenciled number that looked official in an unconvincing way. The power cord wasn't plugged into the strip on the wall. The strip itself was off. Still, when I leaned nearer, a dry, insect-sized crackle rose out of the speaker and died, like a throat clearing in a room that didn't want to encourage conversation. The smell around the radio was warm dust and something sharper, ozone maybe, or memory of it, the way old electronics hold their own weather, even when they sleep. On a shallow shelf, someone had placed a neat stack of glossy prints bound by a rubber band that had flattened to a ribbon. I slid the band off and let the images announce themselves in the blunt way photographs do. The first few were landscapes. The meadow I'd stared at 15 minutes earlier, the line of the dark trees, the mountain, each at sunrise and then not, each labeled on the back with date and temp in pencil. 6:11 a.m. The angle was precise, low, exactly where your head would be if you were lying in the bed upstairs, camera held at chin, eyes open on the day whether you wanted or not. A few were night, window black, chandelier dots from the living room reflected the swirl of breath near the lens if whoever took it had been cold. One had a hint of shoulder at the edge of the frame. Plaid, my plaid, I told myself, not mine, just the same blanket, same catalog trap we all fall into. Somewhere in the stack, a picture showed the bed with a shallow valley in the blankets. The shape a body makes when it has just gotten up and stepped away. The timestamp said 3:03. Someone had watched the absence and decided it was worth keeping. I should have taken a picture of the pictures. I didn't. I told myself I was a guest. I would be gentle. I put them back the way I found them and made the rub. Airband to the thing it wanted to do and hang on. The radio made a small popping noise like a swallowed word. The corkboard's pins caught the light and made a scatter of low, artificial stars. My heart measured my head height above concrete and did its arithmetic. 1 rung, 2, back up. I messaged Gabe because I wanted to be the version of myself that tells the host when the fire alarm chirps or the faucet leaks. Hey, quick heads up. The closet floor panel in the bedroom seems to open to a small utility room. I wanted to make sure that's okay to access. Didn't touch anything. Cool space. I immediately hated the word cool. He wrote back, "Oh, that's the crawl. It's for mechanicals and some storage. Please keep closed. Old stair, uneven footing. Thanks for checking." The ease in his message was the kind of ease that comes old. Either he knew exactly what I saw and didn't care, or he had never looked closely enough to own it. I could have left it at that. I came back up, lowered the panel, and it settled back into its frame with the quiet finality of something that knows it belongs. The closet was a closet again. The afternoon broke its long-held breath and shook a thin snowfall out of the clouds, each piece of it a choice. I ate something out of a bag and pretended not to look at the corner where the floor had proved it was more than floor. You can probably imagine how good I am at pretending. I had a plan. Show Gabe the next morning. It felt adult to decide on daylight and company. I slept badly anyway, the kind of surface sleep that hears its own palate click. Sometime after 1, I woke with a precise feeling, like a switch thrown somewhere had changed the pressure in the room by a measurable fraction. From the closet, a tiny sound, not loud enough to qualify as a noise, more like the consonant in a word that language never finished. I lay there with the covers pulled up to my chin like a child, because sometimes all that's left is the shape of old comfort. The house hummed in very polite decibels. The mountain outside continued its long, patient distance. I wouldn't tell you I heard a radio, not exactly, but that small, dry-clearing crackle happened again in a place that didn't have power, and that was enough. Gabe showed up late morning, boots dusted, hair hat flat, friendly in the confident way of a person who talks to thermostats for a living and believes they listen. "Show me?" he asked, and I opened the closet like I was hosting an unveiling, only there was nothing to unveil. The panel didn't give. The circle for my finger was as it had been, but when I pressed, the feel was not of a lid, not of a hinge, but of floor attending to its duty as floor. No flex, no click. The hairline seam, it read as shadow now, the way 2 boards make a line between them just because 2 things touching can't be one thing. Gabe squatted, palms on his thighs, looked without touching like a man in a museum. "Sometimes the lacquer makes an air seal," he offered. "Temperature change. Wood does what wood does." He knocked once, polite, and the sound came back dull and ordinary. "I swear," I said too quickly. "There's a space, ladder, like a little room." He smiled, which is how you help people not feel like they're making things up. "Oh, there's a foundation crawl," he said, as if recalling something he'd filed under boring. "Access is from the utility closet in the hall. We keep the mechanical shut. You know, liability." He stood and shifted his weight, and the floor under him did not answer. I waited for some sign, dust at the seam, a colder stripe under my palm, but all I could find was the closet being exactly what it claimed. "You're good?" he asked. "I'm good," I lied, and we both believed ourselves as much as we could afford. After he left, I moved slow, made coffee, stood at the window, and tried to let large distances reset the scale of small puzzles. I told myself everything reasonable. Maybe this place had 2 accesses and I'd misunderstood the lines of the building. Maybe the trapdoor swelled and stuck. Wood does that, even engineered wood. Maybe the radio had been a battery caught on its last little bite of charge. Maybe the photos were from a previous owner with a thing for documenting light, the way some people chart their plants. Maybe I am the kind of person who pulls old tension down over new facts because that counts as continuity, and continuity is what keeps me from pitching myself into the white space outside the windows. Night returned like it always does, with the slight cruelty of repetition. I lay with my ear near the seam just to prove to myself that wood's silence is as honest as its sound. For a moment, a long inhale, counted and felt, I thought I could hear the tiniest HF chatter the way you hear your pulse inside your own head. Clipped, impersonal syllables stitched to numbers and then nothing. The radiator in the hall clicked. A plow blade far down the road caught a manhole and sang. In the morning, on the closet floor, the dust had replayed itself into a faint oval smudge the size of the heel of a hand, right where my hand would be if I had reached down in the night and pressed, except I hadn't. The corner of the winter bin wore a clean nick on its lid that I did not remember being there, a small shiny bite where plastic had learned it was breakable. I checked out the next day because that had been the plan, and I am a person who follows a plan even when it feels like the plan is following me. Gabe texted, "Hope the chalet treated you right. Watch for elk on 285. Come back anytime." I typed, "Beautiful place, thank you. One tiny thing, the bedroom closet floor felt springy yesterday. Might be worth a look." He replied with, "Ah, will do. Squeaky hinges all over this place. Appreciate it. Hinge, not panel. Squeak, not click." Our words argued and won nothing. On the drive down, the mountain let me go the way mountains do, by not noticing. For weeks afterward, the sound of any hinge lifting in any room tightened a muscle I'd forgotten I had in my back. USGS maps showed. D up in my dreams, blank spaces finding their names in pencil between the time my eyes closed and opened. If I lie on my own bed at home at 3:03, I will sometimes hold my phone in the crook of my chin and take a picture of the dark window to prove to myself there is no reason to keep it. It never helps. I still think about that small room under the room, the radio that had nothing and said something anyway, and the fact that sometimes a floor behaves itself so well in front of witnesses that you are forced to admit the truth. Some doors are happiest when they are nobody's proof. I booked the Yorkshire cottage because I wanted weather I could blame things on. Where I'm from, the sky is a wallpaper you stop noticing. On the moor, the wind is an animal that puts its head in your lap and decides for you. The listing used words that sounded like lullabies for adults. Restored hearth, original beams, walkable to a pub that serves pie. Photos showed low ceilings with their timber ribs, lime-washed walls, mullioned windows that look better at dusk. Remote but reachable, the host Ruth wrote, and I loved that more than I should have. The lane to the cottage was a punctuation of hedges and blind corners. Sheep watched like skeptics. The house had the crouched look old places get when they've been surviving weather for centuries. Stone that has learned its own patience. A slate roof that hunkers. Inside, slate flags underfoot, uneven as an old smile. The smell of beeswax and ash that never fully leaves a fireplace, however recently it's been cleaned. The sitting room was small enough to know itself. The hearth was big enough to put a person in, a black mouth with a crane arm still intact as if someone might hang a kettle there the moment we stopped cosplaying modern life. Ruth messaged before I'd taken my coat off, "So glad you've arrived. Quick notes, the flue is closed. Please don't. Open the damper. Needs a sweep. The hearth draws oddly and high winds ignore a bit of draft. Radiators on a timer, extra blankets in the chest. The church down the hill rings the hour until 9 p.m. I liked that she knew what mattered in the kind of order that calms people like me. The hearth had a tidy stack, bellows, poker, a little shovel. A narrow iron hook hung from the jamb, decorative or memory. I couldn't tell. When I knelt to look up into the chimney out of habit, the air came down to meet me. Not the soft, unfocused cold of disused space, but a steady, slender thread of chill, as if the fireplace had lungs and had been taught to breathe only when I bent close. The flue lever was wired shut with a ribbon of baling wire that had been painted over 3 times. "Do not," the paint said, and I obeyed. It's a cliché to say the moor is a personality, but it is. Between rain showers that didn't commit and sun that did, I walked up the track past dry stone walls and thought of school history, how houses like this hid people in years when people needed hiding, how priest holes were a fact and not a romantic footnote. I remember a field trip once where we were told to count our breaths under a staircase to feel how long a minute is. My chest still knows that math. Back in the cottage, the draft had found its song. It wasn't loud, but it had a direction, a soft sigh across the hearthstone that made the hairs on my wrist minded. The air touched me and then left, like a hand deciding it had permission and then thinking better of it. The binder on the sideboard had the usual tabs, bins, Wi-Fi, walks, and a thin section titled House History, 17th Century Farmhouse, renovated 1980s, Inglenook preserved. A paragraph mentioned recusancy, a word I had to look up, and then in smaller print, "You may notice odd drafts near the hearth during storms. We're told there were once hiding places in the walls, all sealed now, of course. Please don't tamper with fixtures." Night falls differently where there aren't many lights. The church bell kept its promise and stopped at 9. They'd said. A wind went on being itself. The sitting room's radiator gurgled a little, and the hot water tank made a thick, satisfied sound. I stayed on the small sofa with my feet tucked under me and let the hearth's dark turn into a mirror for the rest of the room. Lamp glow, a cushion's pattern, the ghost of my own shape when I leaned to set down my cup. When the draft strengthened without a reason, as if the room had taken a breath on its own, I told myself what the binder told me. Old houses exhale more than they explain. I meant to believe myself. I could say it was curiosity that took me toward the soot, but it was more like etiquette. When a room keeps offering you the same sensation, you test your manners against it. The wind had settled into a long, thoughtful moan that made the chimney seem taller than it was. I knelt on the flags with the bellows beside me like a prop I didn't know how to use, and I let my fingers learn the face of the fireplace the way you learn a person's, by touch before taxonomy. The stone on the left jamb had been worn smooth, a place where hands had reached often enough to polish grit into silk. Hidden in that polish was a brick that wasn't quite a brick anymore. Soot darkened, yes, but its edge had a slight bevel. My eyes wouldn't have registered if my fingers hadn't told them. I pushed. It didn't move in the obvious way. It rocked very slightly in its bed, a give and hold as if testing my intent. Above it, set high in the throat where smoke would have streaked if smoke were allowed, I saw the faintest scratch, just 3 lines like tally marks arranged in a tiny cross. Not a craftsman's mark, a person's. The idea of finding a lever felt like theater until it wasn't. I pressed again, lower, and the bevel slid. It didn't go in. It slid sideways 1/2 inch with the faintest scrape of grit, and a seam opened in the jamb, not where the brick sat, but behind it, toward the wall. The draft immediately turned from a thread to a shape. Cold air rolled my knuckles like the beginning of a handshake. The panel that gave wasn't dramatic. A hand-wide slice of wall stood off itself on hidden pins and then allowed more if I let it. The inner edge was soot smooth. The outer edge showed lime wash layers like a cake, colors that used to be colors, oat, bone, a green that wished. I widened the opening because I am the version of myself who does that until I'm not. A smell met me that wasn't rot, wasn't damp. It was the mineral, breathless scent of stone that hasn't had a voice in a long time. The cavity wasn't generous. It was a man-wide vertical space with a shelf of stone at knee height and another at shoulder, a geometry that made a body go still. On the inner wall, carved prayers had been scratched with something impatient and faithful. Pater Noster in a hand that shrank when it reached trespasses, a little cross repeated in a line like beads. Someone had tried Latin and used English like a crutch where the words wouldn't come. Ora pro nobis, Lord keep. On the lower shelf lay a brass key, small, mean with verdigris in the teeth, tied to a loop of frayed cord. Beside it, a leather wallet, stiff with age, the kind with a snap so gentle you learn it by listening. The leather had bloomed white in places, salts rising like ghosts. Inside, a bus pass with a punishing photo of a man in his 30s, a folded debit card receipt from a petrol station on the A65, a crumpled note with numbers that didn't look like money. The name on the pass was the kind you recognize because it belongs to people you've known, and a poster you've seen in a shop window once with the words "missing" above it, and then you're not sure if your memory is of this man or of hundreds of men all at once. The date on the bus pass sticker put last use last year. The draft had been a document, not a nuisance. Light found a second seam far back inside, on the opposite wall of the cavity, not toward the chimney, but sideways, where stone gave to a narrower run. My phone light picked out a slot that ran waist to shoulder and then up, a vent that had no business being there unless secrecy is a business. I leaned and saw the line of my own bed beyond, in miniature, through a slit at headboard height where the lime wash had been squared and re-squared, a viewing place disguised in the present by painted timber and the language of feature wall. I took a picture and immediately wished I hadn't. The room I lived in looked foreign inside a coin of light. I texted Ruth with my thumb suddenly clumsy. "Hi, so sorry to bother you. There's a small access behind the hearth. Looks like an old hiding place. There's a draft and some items inside. Should I leave as is?" Didn't touch much. The ellipses came, left, came again. Her reply: "Please do not enter. I'm on my way. Apologies, this shouldn't be accessible. Please do not touch anything further." I read it 3 times, not sure if the fear in me was mine or hers. Ruth arrived with the speed of someone who can drive these roads in her sleep and not feel unkind doing it. She wore a wool hat and a jacket that had been waterproof when waterproof meant something. She stepped in, stood in the doorway of the sitting room for a count that felt like a habit, then came to the hearth and crouched without making a ceremony of it. The way she put her hand on the jamb told me she had done that exact motion before out of a different set of reasons. When the hidden panel breathed with the room's draft, she closed her eyes for a second, a prayer that didn't want witnesses. I'm so sorry, she said, voice low in a room old enough to carry voices long. This was meant to have been sealed. My father. She didn't finish the thought. We had the chimney swept last winter. He must have loosened. She didn't finish that either. She looked at the carved words without aiding them, and reached for the brass key with a care that made me stand very still. She didn't touch the wallet. We'll have to call the police, she said without looking at me. We had someone last year, went missing. They searched the valley. It doesn't mean... She stopped before the sentence could do the work. No sentence could. I wanted to be useful and didn't know how. There's a second opening, I said. Behind the bed, a slit. She shut her eyes again, not surprised, sad like a person who knows the shape of a thing and hoped it would fail to exist this time. Priest holes, she said, the word finally said by someone who had earned it. They never made them just one way. You always leave yourself another exit, sometimes right into the room where no one would think to look, under the bed, behind a coffer. You live in a house this old and it keeps its own conscience, whether you ask it to or not. She stepped into the cavity with a deliberateness I did not have, and put the brass key and the wallet back exactly where they had been. Her hand hovered over the carved crosses as if they were braille and might rearrange under her skin. The draft made her hair lift in the tiniest question. When she came out, she braced a knee against the jamb and pushed the sliding brick you only know about if you know about it, and the panel closed with a decisiveness that had been missing since I arrived. She tied a loop of red twine through the iron hook and around the bellows handle, and then once around the flue's wire, a domestic crosshatch. I'm canceling your stay, she said, and the apology in her mouth had a shape I recognized. Full refund. I'll sort you a room at the pub or in Richmond if you'd rather. I need to make calls. We moved awkwardly around each other as I packed. The cottage shrank in that way places do when they revert to being themselves and take your idea of them away. I didn't sleep there again. I don't know what happened after, if the police came in wellies and ceased artful voices, if they took the wallet away in a bag that made it evidence or returned it to its shelf because it helped nothing to move the past. Ruth texted the next day. We're closed for a bit. Thank you for letting me know. I have your bank details. And again, a week later, unprompted. Are you all right? It was kind and insufficient in the way kindness has to be when there are holes in a story large enough to crawl through. I tried to archive the feeling the way you file a chart. Rationalizations lined up neatly and refused to close the drawer. Old houses have old voids. Drafts find you if you stand still. People leave things in strange places when they are frightened or when they plan to return and can't, or when the place is the only bank they trusted. The name on the bus pass lives in a lot of mouths. Missing is what happens to names when bodies make choices or are given none. That brass key might open a cupboard in a room that no longer exists, or a panel in a bed's headboard that does. I didn't try it. I thought of it, awake in a pub room that smelled like fried oil and polish, and put my hand under the pillow like a child, because I didn't know where else to put it. Afterward, any room with the bed's headboard flush to a wall makes me want to move furniture 2 inches forward. Any fireplace draft that isn't explained by a lever I can name makes my throat want to hum the first bars of a song without words. Sometimes I write Pater Noster in the steam on my bathroom mirror just to see if my hand remembers the shapes. It never looks like the version I saw scratched in stone. There's an appeal in believing a house can keep secrets for good reasons, and an argument in me that says the reasons don't matter to people who go missing. The truth is small. Some bricks slide, some air remembers the direction of a body, some prayers carve themselves into you in a language you don't speak, and a panel that closes neatly in daylight will open again in your head at 3 in the morning, just enough to let the draft cross your wrist and remind you it knows your outline.